And good evening. My name's Risa Edelstein. I'm on the board of the Ecological Landscaping Association, and I am going to be the moderator for this webinar. And I just wanted to welcome everybody to our first webinar of the series titled Ecology Basics for Landscapers and Designers. And this is the first webinar in our series called A Focus on Sustainability. And just a little bit of background is this series was developed by a group of organizations across the country that are known regionally really for their quality education programs. And we are all working together. We're all nonprofit groups, and we're all working together to really try to extend the reach of our educational programs. And in case you're not familiar with the organizations, which, by the way, are mostly volunteer, they're largely volunteer groups. They are the ELA, Ecological Landscape Association, which I'm a part of, and it's mainly in the Northeast USA, and the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, which Sylvan's a part of, and she's in the Washington, D.C. area. The other groups are the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, MELA, which is obviously in the Midwest, and Eco Landscape California, which is out west. So the four of the groups really have been working cohesively to try to bring this webinar series to you, and I'm really excited. It's our first one, and so far I don't think we have too many technical issues, so this is great. So we are, as it's our first one, we're getting used to GoToWebinar, and so I just want to let you know that in terms of your questions, I am going to be the moderator getting your questions, and I will forward them to Sylvan, and she will actually have time during her webinar to take some questions. But I will do my best to answer them as you send them off to me. So everybody should see that question box that's in your control panel. So if that's the best way to ask something. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is just welcome Sylvan. It's been very exciting. She has certainly been on our committee helping us. She's been really instrumental in helping us launch this series. And we're excited to have her. She teaches, just a little background, she teaches as an adjunct professor for George Washington University's Sustainable Landscapes program. And she, as I mentioned, she serves on the board of the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council. So we're very excited to have her tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to pass my controls over to her so she can start her presentation. Okay, and I guess I have this huge list of people. Usually it's just one person, but all the attendees. Okay, so Sylvan, I'm passing controls over to you.
Okay, let me just get my PowerPoint up here. Okay, can you all see my screen, I hope?
I can see it, so.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, unfortunately, when you all type in the question box, I can't actually see the answer, so Risa has to forward me whatever you're saying. So as Risa said, my background is in ecology rather than landscape design or installation, but after years of doing research on plant population and community ecology, I began to work as a land manager and curator at Adkins Arboretum in Maryland, which has a focus on native plants of the Chesapeake Bay region. This work connected the principles of ecology to those of gardening and landscape design, and I now teach ecology to landscape designers at George Washington University and to other groups. Currently, I live, work, and garden in both Denton, Maryland, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and New Mexico has certainly been a change in environment from Denton, so that's been very exciting. So ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other in their environment. This is a picture of my relatively small vegetable garden in Maryland. And I like to think of the garden, not just the vegetable garden, but any garden, as an ecological system or ecosystem. It consists of the species in the garden, the plants, insects, birds, soil bacteria. It also includes the interactions among those species. Bumblebees and honeybees function as pollinators interacting with the plants. And I, as the gardener, select what plants are going to grow there or this afternoon, I spent a lot of time weeding out plants that I didn't want in there, like wiregrass. Whatever turf grass person decided that Bermuda grass would be a good plant for turf must never have had a perennial garden or a vegetable garden. This garden, of course, interacts with the environment. It gets sunlight, water. You can see that I give it supplemental water through the drip hoses, and I provide space for growth by weeding out undesirable plants. And of course, there are lots of cycles of there are cycles of energy, water, and nutrients in the garden, and I, as a gardener, contribute to some of those cycles by, for instance, adding compost to add nutrients to the garden. To really understand how this garden functions as an ecosystem, though, you have to think about it from different scales. So we're going to be discussing ecological concepts that occur at different scales, from the global scale down to the population scale. And just as a brief overview, processes that happen at the global scale affect the entire planet. Things like sea surface temperature changes that result in an El Nino or a La Nina year, long-term climate change, sea level rise. At the landscape level, we're talking about land uses and broad types of living plant communities like rainforests, grasslands, or temperate forests. At the ecosystem level, ecosystems can be very large or very small, but ecosystems are looking at the hydrological cycle, nutrient cycle, and other cycles as they relate to living organisms. Communities are, of course, the assemblage of species in a given area, and then populations are groups of a single species. For this webinar, I won't be covering much about populations, but for the landscaper, this topic would be relevant for understanding the difference between cultivars and straight species, why planting species that are rare in a particular area might not be a good idea, and for understanding the growth cycles of both plants and insects. Hopefully that can be a topic for a future webinar. In an hour, I can only cover so much about the basics of ecology. So in this webinar, there'll be 3 sections. The first section is going to cover the landscape scale, the second, ecosystem processes, and the third, community processes. So it's useful to think about where you work in a broad context. The living areas of the Earth, or biosphere, can be divided into biomes, large areas with relatively uniform vegetation types. They're defined primarily by mean annual temperature and precipitation. One of the reasons why it's important to think about this is because many of the non-native plants we grow come from the same biome in different parts of the world. So, for example, if you're in the temperate deciduous forest, many of the plants that you see in the nursery industry are coming from China, where there's also large areas of temperate deciduous forest. At a local level, you learn what physiographic region you're in, the terrain and geology, and what watershed you live in. You can often find useful information at the watershed level through the EPA's Surf Your Watershed site. And I wanted to mention that there is a link that will be provided to you, if it hasn't already, that tells you that includes a handout with all the references that I mentioned in this talk, as well as some additional references. So don't feel like you need to try to write down all the links and references as I'm going through the webinar. But anyway, this site is very useful because it has information about how much of their watershed is developed, and it can also often include information about local watershed groups and programs for your watershed. So for instance, there are some municipalities in our area that provide funding for homeowners to install rain gardens or other stormwater control landscaping plans. So when I'm developing a plan for a site, I like to look up information on the watershed to get an idea of how my site might be affected by surrounding land uses, and to put the site in context within the local watershed. So Risa, can we try our first poll here? Risa, can you hear me?
Sorry, Sylvan, I can hear you.
Well,
I was muted.
okay.
I was muted and I unmuted. I couldn't find where to unmute myself. So I just launched it. Okay, wait, let me just see. Wait, launch poll. So bear with me. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're going to try polling. And everybody can, oh, the numbers are coming in. Now, Sylvan, you can't see the poll, right?
No, I can't see the poll. I thought I would be able to.
Okay, so it's actually really cool. But so it tells you how many people have voted. So we'll just wait for a few more people to vote, and then I'll let you know where people live. But we've have over 77% of people have voted, and
And actually, if your biome is not listed there, and you can always type in the question area or chat area what biome you're in, or even what part of the country you're in.
So, okay, well, most of the votes are in, so which is really cool. So 69% of people live in the temperate deciduous forest area, 19% in grasslands, 7% in the desert, and 4% in temperate rainforest, and 5% in other. So that's yeah, and mostly everybody voted. So that's very cool.
All right, thanks everyone. As Risa said, this is sort of a new technology for us, so you'll have to bear with us for some things, but we hope the polls will make things a little more interactive. So, Risa, it looks like you need to close the poll so I can go back to showing my screen. There we go. I think. Okay. So this map shows Bethesda, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C. You can see, oh, maybe you can, okay, here you can see Bethesda over here, and Rock Creek Park is over here. It's a very long, narrow park that runs from D.C. North, and you can see major roadways in yellow. Most of our landscapes are a patchwork of land uses, including forest, backyards, parking lots, and streams. Large patches of natural area, like forests, wetlands, and meadows, will support more species than small patches. But many species need a way to move from one patch to another. So could a corridor of vegetation be created to allow species to travel from Rock Creek Park over past this golf course here to this little forest patch in the lower left corner? What if everyone in these neighborhoods could be convinced to transform their yard into a habitat suitable for native plants and wildlife? In a community focusing on protecting high-quality forests and wetlands and connecting them through corridors of green space to other parks and preserves will help support plants and animals in the entire area. Our landscapes are partly a product of human and natural disturbances. Types of disturbances affecting plant communities could be natural disturbances like fires, storms, pests and diseases, or landslides, or they can be human-caused disturbances like logging, mining, farming, or development. It's the frequency and intensity of disturbances that can change what species grow in a particular area. For instance, in a southern temperate forest with frequent fires, loblolly pine would be favored over thin-barked red maple and beech because the loblolly pine is more fire-tolerant. A severe hurricane might return a forest to an early successional stage, but a minor windstorm might just create some gaps that favor fast-growing trees but leave the surrounding late successional forest intact. Prolonged drought coupled with insect outbreaks in the southwest are converting pinyon juniper woodlands to desert grasslands. Human activities mimic disturbances in some ways. Plowing, for example, exposes bare soil similar to a landslide or flood, but it breaks up the soil in a different way. Logging creates canopy gaps or large cleared areas like a storm would, but loggers would likely selectively take certain trees and fewer snags would be left. Those are just some examples of the differences between human and natural disturbances. The frequency and extent of the human activities also influences future plant and animal communities. As landscapers and gardeners, we often create small-scale disturbances by exposing bare ground, mowing, or removing trees and shrubs. Because of disturbances, plant communities do not remain static over time. Succession is the change in species composition over time within a community. And it can be divided into primary succession, where organisms colonize where there's no pre-existing community, like after a rock slide or a volcano explodes, or even on a rock or beach sand, versus secondary succession, where plants are colonizing a pre-existing community. And so that would be the example here, where this field might eventually succeed to be a forest. It's very important to think of succession as an ongoing process and not a linear process. In an old-growth forest even, trees fall and they leave gaps that are filled with fast-growing early successional plants, for instance. As communities mature, they generally gain a more complex structure, and they're home to more different species. So in this forest over here, you can see that there are tall canopy trees, there are trees in the mid-level of the canopy, and an assortment of plants at the ground level. And this variety, this diversity of levels in the forest create many more different habitats for animals, and we'll be talking about habitats specifically later. Think about what stage of succession the landscape you're working on is in. We are usually working with secondary succession rather than primary succession. Gardens undergo succession too, and gardeners and landscapers do many things to change the course of succession. We tend to select certain species over others as we're weeding or making choices in plantings. We create bare ground through tilling or digging, and we might plant a late successional tree species in a lawn. Maintaining a meadow, for example, is a choice to favor a certain successional stage through frequent disturbance, whether you mow or burn to keep out woody species. It's also important to understand how people have influenced the landscape that we now live in. Native Americans had a big influence on the landscape before European settlement, particularly in regions where they had larger scale agriculture. They also used fire to manage some landscapes. Extensive land clearing in the eastern U.S. began in the 1700s as European settlers cleared fields and iron furnaces consumed acres of wood for smelting iron ore. Deforestation increased rapidly starting in the early 1800s across the eastern United States and then into the western United States. Forest conservation initiatives and abandonment of marginal agricultural fields in the 20th century led to some regrowth of forests, but more recently second growth forests are being cut down again to make way for housing developments, roads, and office parks. The growth of suburbs after World War II changed many landscapes around U.S. cities. In the western United States, introduction of cattle altered many landscapes forever, as did poor farming practices and a prolonged drought that led to the Dust Bowl. Fire suppression in different parts of the U.S. have also changed forests, resulting in higher tree densities in some places and different sets of species than you would have found before fire suppression. The legacy of land use includes changes to soils. There's many areas with compacted soils or where topsoil has been lost through erosion, changes to streams. The amount of sedimentation that followed deforestation in the 1800s really was just amazing, and some stream beds are now feet above where they were originally because of all the sediment that flowed into those streams. Many of our streams in urban areas have been channelized, and the increased runoff in urban areas has really damaged a lot of streams and has also increased water pollution. The increase in impervious surfaces in urban areas has also increased, and this, if you think about a forest, if there's a rainstorm in a forest, only about 10% of water from a storm ends up as runoff, but in an urban area, runoff increases to about 20% or more. Plant and animal communities have been affected as their habitats have been fragmented and they've lost migratory pathways. There's been a loss of pollinators and seed dispersers, introduction of exotic species, and changes in fire regimes. So learning about land use history in the area where you work can help you evaluate factors such as the health of soils, streams, and plant communities at a site, and to help you recognize what changes might have taken place at that site, and help you decide what the best landscaping solution might be. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions about this first section.
Okay, Sylvan, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No questions coming in. Just a few people not able to connect. So, but
okay.
Okay. So here's one question from Marini. I hope I said that. How do you best research land use history?
Yeah, it depends on what region you're in. Increasingly information's available online. You can, there's some good histories about land use in different areas, but for your specific site, you probably need to look back at old land records or aerial photographs. It's getting easier if you go through the USGS, the US Geological Survey, to find old aerial photographs of your site, and you can see whether that site used to be agricultural land and how long ago that was, or whether it was forested, or what land use change has happened over time.
Okay, I think we're, any other questions? Again, just remember the question box is on your control panel, and people have been using it. Oh, wait. So Stephen Zine, I hope I pronounced that properly, Stephen, but he said that some soil surveys have old land use. Do you know what that means?
Yes, soil surveys are another good resource. Yeah. You can actually also look on Google Earth, and they have a feature where you can look back at old aerial images on Google Earth as well. For some regions, it sort of depends on where you are. Okay, so I'm going to move on then to talking about ecosystem processes. So the study of ecosystems looks at the flow of energy, water, and nutrients through living systems. And gaining an understanding of these cycles helps to explain what sustainability means from an ecological point of view. Changing the balance within these cycles leads to fundamental ecological changes that affect human well-being. So as designers and landscapers, you can use your knowledge of these cycles to understand things like composting, improving stormwater management, and integrated pest management. For this webinar, we'll be looking briefly at the flow of energy, water, carbon, and nitrogen. And I have to say that, that ecosystem processes have never been the most exciting topic to me, but I do feel they're incredibly important. So I hope this will be a review for most of you. But plants photosynthesize, they convert carbon dioxide from the air and use the energy of the sun to convert the carbon dioxide into sugars through photosynthesis. It takes place in the green-colored chlorophyll structures in the cells of the plant. Sugar is then an organic compound which can be used in combination with other molecules to make the tissues of the plant. The plant gets these other molecules, such as nitrogen and iron, through its roots. Animals get their energy by eating the organic molecules of plants or other animals. And often animal behavior is strongly influenced by the search for food, so that's something to consider if you're interested in wildlife, in creating wildlife habitat. For example, some animals establish territories like fox or wrens, and other animals are generalist predators. They'll eat many different types of food, such as a deer, or others are specialists, like the monarch butterfly caterpillar in this picture, which only feeds on plants in the milkweed family. Food webs represent how energy flows from one organism to another, and they show the complexity that develops within communities. Think about what would happen if one of these organisms were to disappear from this food web. For example, if this if a pollinator of these flowers here were to disappear, then the mouse would have fewer seeds to eat potentially, and mice populations would decline, and that would mean less food for snakes, hawks, and this fox or wolf up here. Pollinators, in this case, might be an example of a keystone species, a species whose importance is greater than its relative abundance in the ecosystem. Something else that you can think of in relation to a food web are insect outbreaks. For example, if there were an increase in grasshoppers, there would be less food available for deer and mice because the grasshoppers would deplete the plants that they ate. Often food webs have been disrupted in urban areas or even in rural areas where large predators are viewed as enemies of livestock or pesticide use has inadvertently killed off pollinators. Consider how the food web might have been altered where you're working and what you can do to increase the complexity and the stability of the food web. Fresh, clean water is an increasingly scarce resource throughout the world. Even though 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, less than 1% is fresh water in lakes, rivers, and groundwater. Another 2% of water is held in polar ice caps and glaciers, and the remaining 97% of water is contained in the oceans. Most people have a good general understanding of how the water cycle works. Water evaporates from lakes and the ocean and rivers. That water condenses in the atmosphere and is returned to Earth as rain or snow. It runs downhill into lakes and rivers. Some of it infiltrates into the ground and is stored there as groundwater, filling in pores in the soil, or it percolates into underground aquifers. If groundwater reaches the surface through a spring or a lake, or just because of a high water table, that water rejoins the surface waters of lakes and rivers. So let's look at how human activities have altered the water cycle. Obviously, hard surfaces have increased surface area runoff. Built environments also tend to have compacted soils that can't hold as much water and less evapotranspiration since there are fewer plants. Groundwater is used up as people pump water from wells, and there is less recharge of groundwater because areas where water used to be able to slowly infiltrate are gone. More rainfall reaches the ground because there are fewer plants intercepting rainfall, and natural drainage patterns have disappeared. Water tends to move faster across the landscape in a storm sewer or a channelized river than it would have with wetlands and curving streams in place. Features such as rain gardens, wetlands, and better plant choices can help keep the water cycle in balance. The next cycle we'll look at is the carbon cycle. Carbon occurs mostly as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but there are also trace amounts of methane and carbon monoxide. Plants uptake carbon in the form of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. But this uptake is approximately equal to the amount of carbon released through respiration by primary producers, consumers, and decomposers. I often find that people forget that plants not only photosynthesize, but they also respire, just like other organisms do. Carbon becomes stored in terrestrial and aquatic systems long-term as fossil fuel, peat, soils, and carbonate rock. For shorter periods of time, it's stored in plant and animal biomass, including what biomass is used to produce such things as paper or wooden houses. The ocean stores large amounts of carbon too, and there's increasing concern because ocean water has become more acidic as carbon dioxide levels have risen. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have risen substantially since 1750 due to human activities. This figure shows measurements of carbon dioxide from prehistoric times to the present. So on all three of these graphs, the concentration of carbon dioxide is shown on the y-axis, and the years are shown on the x-axis. So you can see that there's always been fluctuation in CO2 levels, but CO2 levels now are way above what they ever have been historically in the past. Zooming in a little bit, you can see that this spike started around the 1800s, around the time of Industrial Revolution. And here since 1950, you can see the increase of carbon dioxide from about 310 parts per million to 380 parts per million. And so again, this is way above what Earth has experienced in the past, and this is due mainly to the burning of fossil fuels. Deforestation contributes to carbon dioxide increases as well, but often these increases are balanced by the regrowth of crops or new tree cover. The loss of vegetation also results in the release of carbon dioxide that are stored in soils, and that's become an increasing something that people are increasingly looking at is the loss of carbon dioxide from soils. I included here two things that are related to landscaping more particularly. One is the production of cement, which contributes to about 2.4% of the global emissions from industrial and energy sources. And then peat moss harvesting, which is a relatively small contributor, but peat moss stores a lot of carbon dioxide, and it's something that's commonly used in the nursery and landscaping industries. At the global scale, changing landscaping practices may have relatively little influence on atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, but consider using more fuel-efficient equipment, reducing the use of peat moss and concrete products, reducing soil disturbance, and planting more plants to absorb carbon dioxide. The rising carbon dioxide levels are coupled with rising temperatures, and both will have major consequences for landscapers. Plants initially respond to higher carbon dioxide levels by increasing their rate of growth, but growth is limited by many resources, and so plants eventually are going to be limited by water and nutrient limitations in particular. And scientists have already seen that when they're studying growth rates in forests, that the growth rates level out after several years of increased carbon dioxide levels. Some unexpected consequences of carbon dioxide increases that have been discovered are that ragweed increases its pollen production along with other weedy plants, and poison ivy leaves have greater toxicity and there's production of more leaves. So that's very bad news for us landscapers. Temperature changes have already resulted in plants shifting their ranges northward or up in elevation. There's much concern that that could lead to the loss of species if their shift in ranges is blocked by inhospitable habitat, like you saw in that picture of the Bethesda area, where it would just be difficult for plants and animals to move under their own auspices. It further emphasizes the importance that urban and suburban habitats could have in linking natural areas. So now I want to try doing a second poll. So Risa, if you can put up poll number 2.
Okay, I'm going to do that, and in the meantime, okay, so poll number 2, which is about the climate change in your area, we're going to launch that. And Sylvan, while people are taking the poll, okay, so the poll is, how do you most notice climate change in your region? And while you're doing that, I had another question, which I thought I could forward to you, but I can't, so maybe you can answer it. It's from Michelle Krugel, and she says, how does making of cement impact the carbon cycle?
Okay. So the making of cement it uses a lot of energy to produce the cement, and so the fossil fuels that are used in the production are what's contributing to carbon dioxide.
Okay. So now you, in your poll, all the votes are coming in. You had a poll where you had to select one of the following, but someone in the questions, they said to me that they're seeing all of the above. So in terms of the changes, in their region.
Ah, right, right. Yeah, I put all of the above as one option in case.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. I didn't even realize that. Yeah. So, so I now I figured out how to do the poll is you could actually close it when the most of the votes come in. I'm going to close it, and then I'm going to we'll launch it so that everybody could see the results. That was my
Ah, great.
first.
Okay.
That was my first poll, the first one. So, uh, so I'll just wait. If you haven't voted, send your votes in, and then I'll close it. Okay, there's another question in the meantime, maybe you can answer, is about if you have time, can you explain how carbon is lost from exposed soils? And that's from Stephen Zine again, which I probably didn't pronounce his name properly.
So carbon is lost from exposed soils because, well, there are numerous reasons. One is that there's more oxidation that takes place when soils are exposed to the air, and so that ends up releasing more carbon dioxide. And then a lot of the organisms in the soil are killed off, and so as they decay, that releases carbon dioxide that doesn't necessarily get taken up by other organisms right away. So I need, that's something I need to do a little more research on, but I know those are two of the ways, and there may be some other ways as well.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to close the poll, and 83% of people voted, and then I'm going to share the results. There we go. So you can see them, right, Sylvan?
No. It does say sharing poll results, but I don't get to see them.
Huh. Okay, well, I'm wondering if no one else can see them. Okay, well, I'll tell you what the answer.
You all see the poll results,
audience?
audience?
I see them. Okay, well, a bunch of people say they see them, so I'm not sure why you can't see them.
It may be that I would have to minimize my PowerPoint presentation to see them.
Oh, okay. So I'll tell you. So, well, 36% of people said all of the above. 26% said more extreme periods of drought. 18% said increased frequency of high water, stormwater runoff, or tide. And 16% said plants flower earlier. And 4% said none of the above. So that's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so if y'all been following the news lately, of course, there's a lot of controversy about extreme storm events and whether that's related to climate change or not. And there are a lot of different arguments about that, so I'm not going to try to go into that.
Okay. Everybody was so nice. They all emailed me that they can see them, so that's great.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think you need to hide the poll results again.
Oh, okay, right. Sorry. Okay, there we go.
Okay. All right, the last cycle I'm going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. Humans have also had a big impact on nitrogen. It exists in the atmosphere in gaseous forms, and then it's fixed or converted to forms that are usable by plants and animals through the action of bacteria or lightning. Plants take up nitrogen in the form of nitrates mainly, and that nitrogen is passed along to animals, and when plants and animals die, it cycles within the terrestrial system. Some of it's also lost back to the atmosphere, though, as other bacteria convert it back to a gaseous form. People have contributed greatly to the amount of fixed nitrogen through the production of fertilizer, and by planting nitrogen-fixing crops like soybeans. We add to gaseous forms of nitrogen when we burn fossil fuels. Humans have doubled the amount of nitrogen fixation through the production of chemical fertilizers and the planting of nitrogen-fixing crops like soybeans, which is something that's planted frequently around here, and so I see them every day and have realized just how many of them there are. The enrichment of soils from chemical fertilizers, manure, and the deposition of atmospheric nitrogen have resulted in the loss of diversity in some ecosystems, particularly those in which the plants were adapted to low nutrient soils. Often diversity is inversely related to nutrient availability because one species is more likely to dominate in a nutrient-rich system. And so this is why sometimes if you're trying to establish a meadow in an area where there's been a lot of nitrogen enrichment, you may have a lot of weed problems. And if you can reduce the amount of nitrogen in the soil before you do your planting of native species, you will have more success. You may have more success anyway at keeping weeds out and encouraging more diverse native populations of plants, or more diverse community of native plants. Deforestation and other forms of land clearing have led to increases in nitrate flow in streams and nitrous oxide loss to the atmosphere. When land is cleared, there's no longer vegetation to take up nitrogen produced during decomposition, and that nitrogen is washed away into streams or it's released to the atmosphere. The vegetation also took up large quantities of water that, without the forest in place, leaches nutrients out of the ground. Potassium and calcium are often leached out of soils along with nitrates when there's deforestation. When this nutrient-enriched runoff reaches lakes and rivers, it can result in eutrophication, or the over-fertilization of water, and that can lead to harmful algal blooms and a loss of oxygen in the waters. Some of the nitrogen in manure and urine is also volatilized back into the atmosphere, and along with the release of nitrous oxide from the burning of oil and coal, this contributes to acid rain. Nitrogen is only one of the elements in soils that will make a difference in how well the plants you select will thrive. So always do soil tests before deciding whether you need nutrient applications on a site, and try to select plants that will thrive in the existing soil conditions. Or, like as I mentioned before, maybe you need to reduce the nutrient levels if you're trying to establish a certain type of community. Look for signs that water features such as small ponds and lakes are not being harmed by the over-application of nutrients as well. All right, so are there any questions that didn't get answered during the last poll about ecosystem processes?
Sylvan, I have some questions from people, so sorry. Okay, so the first one's from Kate Stafford, and she's like, how does increased CO2 in the atmosphere cause increased poison ivy toxicity and increased ragweed pollen production?
So, plants can grow faster if they have more carbon dioxide available, and so the increased carbon dioxide levels, and probably to a certain extent the increased temperatures in combination with that, as long as those plants have plenty of access to water and nutrients, then they're able to produce basically more flowers and more biomass and more seeds. So if ragweed is growing more quickly and producing more biomass, then part of that is likely to be producing more flowers and therefore more pollen. And same thing with the poison ivy. It's expensive for a plant to produce toxins that deter predators, which is basically what the oils and poison ivy do. And so, if it has plenty of resources available, then it can, then it's essentially, it has more resources available to produce toxins to deter predators. And that research was mainly, the papers I've read have been by Louis Ziska, who works for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. His last name is Z-I-S-K-A, if you want to look up the research. And I unfortunately forgot to put, or I didn't think to put his paper on the resource list. But I can amend that and repost it.
Okay. So, okay, do you want the next question?
Sure.
This is from Tony Bailey. And the question is it a bad idea to plant cover crops like clover as a means of soil conditioning?
Ah, hi Tony, I know you. So it's not necessarily a bad idea if you are trying to increase the nitrogen level in a certain location. But you might want to think about planting a cover crop that would use up nitrogen if you're trying to lower the nutrient conditions on a plot. And so, planting a cover crop, you just need to think about what your goals for that cover crop are. Is it just to reduce weeds, or are you trying to increase or decrease soil nutrients as well?
Okay. Okay, the next question, I don't know if this is too general, but it's from Regina Irizarry, and it says, how can one reduce nitrogen levels?
Nitrogen levels are usually reduced by adding sawdust or wood chips to soil. There have also been some experiments adding sulfur, which will also bind up some of the nitrogen. So it's usually done on a smaller scale, but that's how people would reduce nitrogen usually in a, like, say if you were trying to establish a meadow.
Okay, so I guess that's the, I mean, that was someone else asked the same question, and then this person, Thomas, I can't pronounce your last name, Thomas, I'm sorry. But when establishing a meadow in an area with elevated nitrogen levels, how would you reduce levels of nitrogen? So that's a wider area. So is that the same answer or any?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Okay. Okay, oh, that was a popular question. Wait, I'm just going through some.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Anna Best asked, at some point at the end, we explain how to access the resource list. So everybody will get a follow-up email to this webinar, I'm hoping, but that's the plan. And then it should have a link to a page, right, that you put up, Sylvan, correct?
Yes, that's right. Well, it's actually on the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council webinar page right now. But
okay. So, and that email probably will go out in maybe 2 or 3 days, because we also want to include a link to the recorded webinar. So we're just playing with understanding that. So, so that's our hope. Okay, let's see. Okay, this is Tracy Neal. Won't growing plants that use loss of nitrogen delete nitrogen stores?
it can, yeah. So that would be another approach to take if you were, if you can do a rotation, or if you're sort of planning a successional process in your plantings, that you could start out with a plant that uses a lot of nitrogen, and then that would deplete the nitrogen in the soil a little bit, and then you could plant plants that preferred low nitrogen soils. Hi, Tracy.
Okay, so the next question is from someone I know, Monique. Hi, Monique. She says, would milky oats or buckwheat use up nitrogen in the soil?
I don't know the answer to that. I would need to look up what plants are heavy users of nitrogen, and I don't know whether those two are or not.
Okay, that's a smart question, Monique.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does anyone else in the audience happen to know?
Yeah, you can post that in the questions. Well, Carol Jelich said maybe you could plant a corn crop to take it up. Is that? You're laughing, but I don't get the joke. But
oh well, so corn is a very heavy feeder, and so so corn, if you wanted to plant a corn crop and then take it out, then you probably would end up using up nitrogen that's in the soil.
Oh, okay. And then Hillary said monocots.
Yeah, so corn is a monocot. Monocots are grasses,
okay,
and some other plants. But so yeah, so planting a grass is likely to, I guess monocots might in general be heavy users of nitrogen.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you. So any other questions? I think we've gone through them. I like this question thing. It's really easy and it's so fun.
Okay.
Okay, here. So, okay. Oh, we got a few more questions. So, Terry Enright, is there a resource to look at the lists plants? Okay, is there, in other words, can you look up plants according to their nitrogen uptake? Is there any place, a resource to look that up?
Not that I know of, but I will see if I can find something. Does anyone else know of a good resource for that?
Okay, let's see. Then just a little comment from Stephen Zine again. Is some nitrogen also leaches out of the soil fairly quickly when irrigated? So I guess.
Yes, that's true too. So if water is not a limited resource for you, then you could water your soils. Although you have to think maybe about where the nitrogen is going if you do that.
Oh, right, right. Could flow downstream into something else. Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, let me go on then to the last section of the talk. So now we're going to be stepping down to look at communities, and this is more at the what I tend to get excited about and what I've done the most research on are communities and habitats. So different land uses and the disturbance regimes that we talked about lead to different communities of species. So for example, this great blue heron thrives in a community that's made up of fish, frogs, wild rice, ash and red maple trees, cattails, wood ducks, muskrats, beaver, and many other organisms. So the community is the assemblage of all the species in a given area. Its habitat, the physical space that provides the environment and resources needed for a population to survive and reproduce. So the habitat for this blue heron population includes the wetland where its food sources live and trees to build huge nests in. The roadrunner, on the other hand, lives in a desert and pinyon juniper or grassland habitat where it feeds on lizards, small snakes, insects, and mice. It nests in the cholla cactus and in low trees and shrubs, making a nest of twigs lined with grasses. A garden is a community of plants that you have assembled, as well as the critters that come to pollinate, disperse seeds, and eat the plants. And of course, humans are a critical element of any garden or landscape that you've created for people to use. You create habitat for these species by providing space, food, water, and shelter. And so this little bunny rabbit here is enjoying the newly planted Santa Fe Botanic Garden. Even though all of these organisms share a habitat, they do not have exactly the same environmental and resource requirements. Researching a particular species niche requires learning about its life cycle, resource needs, and the other organism the species associates with. So a niche is all of the environmental conditions and resources that are required to maintain a viable population of a species. Concepts like companion planting and intercropping come from learning what plants' niches complement each other. So for example, these bean plants are providing nitrogen that feeds the Swiss chard here, and the alyssum is attracting pollinators that will pollinate the bean plants. Thinking about the functions that an organism plays in the environment can help in grouping species that play a similar role. For example, species can be grouped by their trophic level or their place in the food chain. So producers are the plants that are that are getting energy from sunlight to produce carbon. Herbivores are the animals that eat the plants, and then carnivores are animals that eat other animals. So those are all examples of different functional groups in a trophic system. But you can also group species by, in addition to how they obtain food, you can also group them by other types of interactions. So interactions that benefit both organisms, such as pollination or seed dispersal, are referred to as mutualisms. Parasites, on the other hand, benefit from their host, but the host suffers in the interaction. And then there are other functional groups like nitrogen fixers, the legumes, and some other species. Competitors, predators, those would all be examples of functional groups. In many of the areas where we work, particularly urban areas, a particular functional group might be missing or depleted, so you'd have to think about whether you can restore that group. So for example, there are top predators like wolves and bobcats that are missing in most of our urban and suburban areas now, and as a consequence, deer populations have exploded. And to a certain extent, cars have taken over as a top predator of deer in many urban areas, although much to the detriment of people, unfortunately. because of the decline in honeybee populations, there's also renewed interest in agriculture and horticulture in native pollinators. And so I wanted to focus on the functional group of pollinators for a minute here. Honeybees, of course, originated in Europe and Africa. Habitat loss, pesticide use, and diseases are contributing to the decline in populations of pollinators. But by reducing pesticide use and creating and conserving pollinator habitat, we can help out native pollinators. Some of the most common native pollinators include solitary bees like this mason bee and bumblebees. Wasps, flies, butterflies, and hummingbirds also pollinate some flowers. Interestingly, yellow jackets and the European black and yellow paper wasps are also not native, even though they may sometimes be found on a plant, although yellow jackets not so much. I wanted to just mention briefly these organ-shaped mud tubes are made by the mud dauber wasp, which is a good pollinator. And I was fascinated by these guys as a kid because they would build the nests on the side of our house all the time. And they stuff these nests full of paralyzed spiders, and then the wasp lays its egg on the paralyzed spiders, and the larvae eat the spiders before growing into an adult wasp. So that's just one of the amazing pollinating insects. This block of wood down here is a mason bee nest, and it's very easy to make these. It's just a wooden block with holes drilled in it, and then the mason bees will nest in the holes and plug up the end of the hole there until the larvae grow and hatch out. So I think we have one final poll here, if Lisa can pull that up.
Do you see that? I launched it. What functional groups do soybeans belong to? Oh, people are voting.
This should be a quick poll.
Okay, the votes are coming in. Just wait for a few more. Excuse me. Okay, so we're going to close the poll, and then we're going to share results. And so, Sylvan, you can't see them, but 51% said that soybeans belong to the group nitrogen fixer, and 41% said all of the above.
Right, so if I remember my answer correctly, I think all of the above is the correct answer, but certainly nitrogen fixer is how most of us, is one of the functions of soybeans that most of us think about.
Yeah, the other choices were producer, competitor, insect, host, plant.
Ah, yes, right. Well, as the kudzu bug makes its way north, it's found to, it feeds not only on kudzu, which is probably a good thing, but it also feeds on soybeans, which farmers consider a bad thing. So there it is as one example of an insect host. All right, so if you want to close that, I'm just going to put up my final slide, and then I'll take more questions. So you could describe the ultimate goal of using ecological principles in landscaping as being to conserve biodiversity. And biodiversity is not just the number and distribution of species in an ecosystem, but it's also the diversity of genes within species, communities within ecosystems, and ecosystems within landscapes. Biodiversity has economic importance as well as ecological value. And to most of us, it also has cultural and intrinsic value. So from an ecological perspective, more diverse ecosystems tend to be more stable in the face of disturbances, and they recover faster or are more resilient after a disturbance. They also tend to perform ecosystem functions better, such as slowing and cleaning stormwater runoff, absorbing and storing carbon dioxide, and providing resources for people. So designers and landscapers can promote biodiversity by including native plants in gardens, and also I should add by including not just cultivars of native plants, but also straight species of native plants, because the species tend to have more genetic diversity. Providing wildlife habitat, controlling invasive species, which often lessen diversity or have negative impacts on wildlife. Minimizing the use of pesticides and herbicides, retaining and reusing stormwater runoff, and reusing and recycling materials. So I hope this webinar has given you some new ecological principles to think about in designing, installing, and maintaining landscapes. I know it was a